Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. My name is Eric Novak. I'm a senior research fellow at the University of Bucharest, specializing in medieval Eastern European history, cryptology, and ancient folklore. Before the outbreak, I spent the better part of a decade traveling between the archives of Sibiu, Timisoara, and the old monasteries in Maramureş, piecing together the tangled legacy of Vlad III Dracula, also known to the world as Dracula. I never believed the vampire stories, of course. They were myth layered on myth, fabrications built atop a kernel of cruel historical truth. But now, after what I've seen, after what I've lived through, now I believe in things I once wrote off as superstition. October 1st, Brasov, Romania. I was in Brasov on the day the outbreak reached us. The city had felt tense for weeks. The Romanian government was issuing strange, contradictory bulletins. There were lockdowns in Bucharest, a riot in Cluj, and something about a military quarantine near Constanta on the Black Sea coast. They said it was rabies, maybe a new mutation of a prion disease. But those of us who studied history knew better. When people start tearing each other apart in the streets, it's never just science, it's fear, it's madness. My contact at the National Archive, a woman named Larissa, met me at the first Romanian school museum. I'd come for a series of coded letters allegedly penned by Vlad III himself, but her hands were shaking as she handed them to me. "There are rumours," she said in a low voice, eyes flicking to the stained glass windows, "of something ancient moving in the mountains again." I dismissed it. I'd heard old legends like that in dozens of villages. Then she said, "I think the Order of the Dragon has reactivated." That stopped me cold. The Order, Dracula's old chivalric brotherhood, wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The idea that some ancient underground network was alive and operating in 2025 sounded ridiculous, but so did what happened next. That night, as I sat reviewing the documents in my hotel near Piața Sfătului, the power went out. Moments later, I heard screaming in the square. Not the usual chaos of a fight or a protest. This was different. Guttural, feral sounds. I looked out my second-story window and saw a crowd of people running down the cobblestone streets, pursued by others who moved in violent, jerking spasms. They attacked with teeth, not fists. There was blood, too much of it. That was the last time I saw Brasov intact. October 2nd, escape to Bran. At first light, I packed my notes and headed west in my old Dacia Duster, a rust-coloured SUV that I'd restored myself. Radio transmissions were chaotic, half-garbled military bands, desperate civilians begging for help, and then strange dead air interrupted by what sounded like Gregorian chanting. I drove along Route 73, through the fog-draped woods toward Bran, hoping to find refuge near the old castle. Yes, that Bran castle, the so-called Castle Dracula. Tourists love it, even though it was only tenuously connected to Vlad III. But I knew of something deeper beneath it. Catacombs that dated back to the 14th century, complete with sealed tunnels, and a crypt rumoured to be part of the original Order's refuge system. By late morning, I reached the village of Bran. It was half abandoned, cars were overturned, doors wide open, livestock wandering free. But the castle loomed intact above the cliffs. I made my way up the old stone path, half expecting to be shot by whoever had taken shelter inside. Instead, I found him. October 3rd, the man in the red cloak. He stood in the shadows of the castle's upper courtyard, tall and rail-thin, with angular features and pale skin untouched by age or sun. His eyes were not human. There was depth to them, like staring into the heart of a star. He wore a cloak the colour of blood and carried a sword that shimmered with old hammered silver. "Dr. Novak," he said in perfect Romanian. though it sounded like the old dialects I'd studied in monastery scrolls. "You've brought the letters." I don't remember speaking. I think I just nodded. He took the bundle of parchment from my hands and opened the top one with a reverence I hadn't expected. "These codes were meant to awaken the order if the pestilence ever returned," he said. "And now it has." I swallowed. "You're saying this is connected to the plague?" "Not the plague," he said, turning. "Something older, something that once slumbered beneath Constantinople. Now it walks again. Who are you?" His eyes met mine. "I am Vlad, not the legend, the man. I know how this sounds. I wouldn't have believed it myself, except that by then I'd already seen too much. I'd seen reanimated corpses tear a police officer in half near Brasov's main square. I'd seen a woman gnawing her own fingers off, unblinking. If this was the apocalypse, why not Dracula? He led me below, down into the cold heart of the mountain. October the 4th. The crypt and the order. The tunnels beneath Bran are not open to tourists. What you see on postcards is just the facade. The real fortress lies underground, a warren of stone passages lit by torches, lined with medieval weaponry and faded standards bearing the order's emblem, a winged dragon biting its own tail. We weren't alone. In the chapel chamber, near the base of the cliff, I met the remnants of the order, men and women who had hidden for centuries, descendants of those loyal knights, trained in esoteric warfare. Among them was Colonel Petre Andrei, a former Romanian intelligence officer, Sura Ionescu, an herbalist and folklorist from Sibiu, and Emil Dobrescu, a priest from the ruins of Poenari Monastery who still spoke fluent Church Slavonic. They'd known this day might come, not zombies specifically, but the return, as they called it, the resurgence of the infected dead, first recorded in Slavic texts from the 9th century. "We always assumed it would be spiritual," Father Dobrescu said. "A metaphor, but it's biological, viral." I asked Vlad, Dracula, or whatever he truly was, how he had survived all these centuries. He only smiled. "History remembers tyrants and forgets the sorcerers who made them," he said. "Let's just say I made a pact with the earth beneath Wallachia, one that demands blood, but gives me time." I believed him. Not because I wanted to, but because I saw what he did next. October the 5th, the siege of Bran. At dawn, the infected came. A swarm of them, hundreds strong, stumbling out of the forests, drawn by scent or instinct or something worse. They were fast, too fast, and seemed to know we were here. The order moved like a machine. Archers took the ramparts with bows strung from yew wood. Others wielded fire, kerosene bombs in clay pots hurled down from the parapets. I manned the battlements with a scoped CZ 557 rifle taken from a dead gendarme near Brasov, picking off the lead infected as they tried to climb the outer walls. Then I saw Vlad descend into the courtyard with nothing but that silver sword and a carved oak stake the length of my forearm. He moved like water, effortless, silent, beautiful. I had never seen a man fight like that, like death incarnate. He didn't just kill the infected, he destroyed them, severing heads with one blow, driving the stake into skulls with inhuman strength. They didn't infect him. They didn't even seem to see him. By the time the last corpse fell, the sky had turned a pale, haunted grey. Bran Castle stood ringed in broken bodies and fire. The upper ramparts slick with blood and ash. Smoke curled from the trebuchet pit where we'd thrown makeshift firebombs into the throng. The surviving members of the order moved quickly, dumping corpses into a limestone trench behind the cliff wall, dousing them with diesel and igniting the pile. The smell of scorched flesh and ancient rot clung to everything. I could taste it in the back of my throat. We didn't speak much that morning. There was no triumph, just silence and motion, an urgency without celebration. The siege had cost us 12 of our fighters. Among them was Sura Ionescu, the herbalist who had tended to wounded villagers in Sibiu during the first weeks of the outbreak. She'd been torn apart, defending the secondary gate. Father Dobrescu closed her eyes with trembling fingers, whispering the old rites. The others dug graves above catacombs, high enough that the infected wouldn't reach them should they reanimate. That night, I couldn't sleep. The castle walls creaked with wind, and somewhere far down the valley, I could hear the shrieking of the stragglers. I sat in the study chamber, going over the encrypted letters Larissa had given me. They were written in a variant of early Wallachian, mixed with Tyronian shorthand, a kind of coded Latin once used by medieval scribes. Slowly, the structure began to unfold, revealing not just warnings, but instructions. The Order had prepared for this. Vlad, or whoever he truly was, had orchestrated contingencies over generations. Caches of weapons buried in forgotten monasteries. Sealed tunnels beneath Sibiu, Iasi, and even Bucharest. There were references to a mountain pass known as the Black Cross, a narrow gorge in the Fagaras range used by boyars and rebels centuries ago. According to the map stitched inside the third letter, there was a hidden bunker at the summit built by the Soviets during the early Cold War, now occupied, if still operational, by a NATO-aligned Romanian mountain division. It might have been abandoned, but it was our best chance. We made the decision before dawn. We would leave Bran. October 6th, into the Carpathians. We moved with precision. 6 survivors from the Order, myself included. Colonel Andrei carried a suppressed Heckler Koch G3 rifle and wore surplus Romanian alpine gear from the Ceahalau unit. Grey-green, worn, but functional. Emil Dobrescu carried only a walking staff and a satchel of blessed objects, more out of tradition than effectiveness. 2 others, Mihai and Christy, were trained climbers from the Order's surviving mountain cell. They handled the route planning and carried ropes, pitons, and a small sat phone that hadn't worked since the first week of the outbreak. Vlad walked alone, slightly ahead of the group. He didn't carry a pack or rifle, just his sword and a weathered black overcoat that rippled behind him like smoke. He didn't speak unless spoken to. I noticed he didn't breathe either, not when climbing, not when resting. Whatever he was, he didn't grow tired. We moved west, passing through the remote forest between Bran and the Piatra Craiului National Park. The terrain was steep, the air damp with the threat of snow. Abandoned cabins dotted the slopes, some with half-barricaded doors, others with signs of struggle, scratches on the wood, blood spattered across shutters. At one cabin, we found a family of 4 huddled together under a frost-covered blanket, their bodies unmarked but stiff. No bites, no blood. They had chosen to die on their own terms. That night, we camped beneath the collapsed stone archway of an old railway spur once used by timber convoys. The rails were rusted and half submerged in moss, the trestles snapped by landslides. Colonel Andrei posted 2-hour watches, but Vlad refused to rest. He stood near the ridge the entire night, unmoving, eyes locked on the stars. I asked him once what he was watching for. He answered without turning, not what, who. October 8th, Black Cross Gorge. We reached the gorge on the 3rd day. The terrain had grown treacherous, jagged rocks covered in ice, sheer drop-offs, and switchback trails, half swallowed by underbrush. According to the map, we were close to the Fagaras ridgeline, and if the bunker still stood, it would be just beyond a ridgeline, known locally as Crucial Negri, the Black Crosses. There were 6 carved wooden crosses embedded in the stone, worn almost flat by centuries of wind and lichen. According to legend, rebels fleeing Ottoman patrols had been ambushed here and executed. Their bones were said to lie scattered beneath the roots of the twisted pine trees that lined the upper path. Mihai set up a drone using a compact DJI model recovered from a defunct forestry outpost. The signal was erratic, but we managed to get a partial scan of the terrain ahead. The gorge was narrow, less than 4 meters across in some places, but it opened into a plateau dotted with concrete structures. The bunker was real, but so were the infected. A mass of them, perhaps 200 or more, gathered near the main entrance. Some stumbled, others crawled, and a few, these were the worst, stood perfectly still, their eyes blank but wide, as if waiting for something. And they weren't alone. Among them stood figures that did not move like the others. They wore pieces of armor, blackened and scorched. Some carried shields etched with orthodox motifs. Others brandished swords or morning stars crusted in old blood. Their flesh was withered but taut, preserved in some unnatural way. Vlad called them the Strigoi Veci, the old dead. They were the first, he said quietly, studying the drone footage. Warriors from the time before the Principality, raised once, sealed long ago. Now they walk again. I asked what had awakened them. The same thing that drives this plague, he said. A seed buried in the earth, something not born of science, but hunger. We couldn't reach the bunker without confronting them. The group debated for hours. Colonel Andrei suggested scaling the north cliff, breaching the bunker through the air vents or escape hatches. Mihai disagreed. The vents would be too narrow for supplies or weapons. Eventually Vlad spoke. "I will go first," he said, unsheathing his sword. "They are drawn to warmth, to blood. I will draw them away. You will follow in the shadow of my wake." We knew better than to argue. October 9th. The descent into fire. At dawn, we watched from the ridgeline as Vlad descended into the heart of the infected. He moved slowly, deliberately, and the moment his foot struck the stone path, the horde stirred. The Strigoi Veci turned first. They hissed in unison, a sound like dry leaves caught in fire. Then the others surged. Dozens of infected sprinted at him, flailing, teeth gnashing, bones cracking from the force of their own movement, and yet none touched him. He fought like nothing I've ever seen, faster than before, a blur of motion, like wind given form. His sword sang through air and bone alike. Where the blade struck, flesh blackened instantly, as if burned from within. The Strigoi tried to surround him, but he moved like mist, teleporting short distances in flickers of shadow and smoke. It wasn't science. It was something older, something beyond the natural order. As he drew the infected away, we rappelled down the cliff face silently and quickly. Christie covered us with a suppressed MP5, aiming only when absolutely necessary. We reached the secondary entrance on the plateau and found the steel hatch rusted but intact. It took Colonel Andrei nearly 10 minutes to override the Soviet-era mechanical lock with a hand crank and torque bar. The second it clicked, we slid inside. The bunker stank of mildew and machine oil. It had been partially looted years ago. Some of the outer rooms were stripped, the generator in pieces, but the core command center remained sealed. Mihai powered up the backup lights with a hand-cranked inverter we'd brought from Bran, illuminating the narrow corridor in flickering yellow. The walls were poured concrete reinforced with rusting rebar, typical of early 1960s Soviet mountain fortifications. The door to the command center bore Cyrillic stenciling worn nearly to nothing, and its locking mechanism was a dual lever hydraulic bolt system, a relic that no one had the training or patience to disarm the usual way. Colonel Andrei slid a thermite charge from his pack, drilled mounting points into the hinges, and lit the fuse with a magnesium rod. The hallway filled with the hiss of white-hot flame and the acrid stink of burning metal. When the smoke cleared, the door hung lopsided, its locking pins glowing cherry red. We pushed inside, weapons raised. The air in the command center was cold, dense and still. Sealed for decades, it smelled faintly of ozone and insulation, not rot. Desks lined the perimeter, and in the center sat a cluster of control consoles beneath a sealed, hexagonal glass dome. Some kind of command map table, complete with analog overlays for troop movements, radio frequencies, and missile alerts. Most of the equipment was dead, the screens cracked and gauges frozen. But the room hadn't been looted like the rest. It had been preserved, protected. Emil stepped forward, crossing himself as he moved. In the far corner, a desiccated corpse slumped over a console, dressed in a faded Soviet officer's uniform. His face had been preserved by the dry air, mummified. There was a small entry wound in the temple. A Makarov pistol lay beside his hand, empty. A final act of duty, or perhaps despair. I opened his coat pocket and found a leather-bound notebook. Written in Russian, it detailed the last known communications from Bucharest, dated October 1963. The final entry was a single word, Cherno Solntsy, black sun. Behind the officer's body was a steel door marked with a radiation warning in faded yellow paint. It was reinforced, thicker than the others, sealed with a rotary valve lock and an old biometric reader that had long since gone dark. We worked in silence to bypass it. Mihai traced the manual override line to a side panel and rewired the circuit to accept an analog pulse from our battery. With a heavy clunk, the lock disengaged. The chamber beyond was lined with lead shielding and black tiles. At its center, mounted on a carbon steel cradle, sat an oblong capsule about the size of a coffin, bolted down with steel brackets and safety chains. It was surrounded by vacuum-sealed containment hatches and a pressure control system labelled in both Russian and German. A Geiger counter left on a side table ticked once, then went still. The capsule wasn't radioactive, not anymore. But the strangest part wasn't the machine. It was the markings etched into the floor around it, symbols older than anything in the bunker, glyphs carved in perfect circles using techniques lost to time. They were Dacian, maybe even older. Some resembled the solar spirals used by the Getae tribes to denote death and return, while others matched markings I'd seen once in a monastery crypt beneath Targovist. It was a prison, not for a man or a bomb, but for something ancient. Vlad arrived an hour later. He stepped into the chamber like a man revisiting a tomb he'd buried himself. He walked slowly to the capsule, running one gloved hand along the edge of its smooth steel surface. Then he spoke, not to us, but to the silence. I swore this would never be opened. The rest of us exchanged glances. Colonel Andrei lowered his rifle. Emil removed his cap. None of us dared interrupt. Vlad turned toward us, his eyes darker than before, his face somehow more human and less at the same time. This was made by men who thought they could harness what they did not understand. In 1957, Soviet cryptologists uncovered a vault beneath Snagov Monastery. They called it Object 17. Inside was a fragment of something, not born on this earth, not divine, not demonic, a seed. That seed was moved here, hidden, protected. He circled the capsule slowly. The plague is not a virus, it is a chain reaction, a psychic infection triggered by proximity to this. It weakens the veil between life and death, twists thought and hunger into a single instinct. Once released, it spreads not through air or bite, but through fear, resonance, entropy. I asked him cautiously, why now? Why had it awakened? Vlad looked at the old console screens. Because the world has grown loud, noisy, billions of minds screaming into the void. The veil thinned, and then something broke through. The rest of us said nothing. What could we say? We were scientists and soldiers, not mystics. But the evidence was in front of us. The bunker, the map, the Strigoi Vechi that followed him. The pandemic had never made sense. It burned too fast in some areas, skipped others. Some were immune with no explanation. Traditional epidemiology couldn't account for the psychic effects, the nightmares, the voices survivors claimed to hear, the loss of identity before death. And now, beneath hundreds of feet of stone, we had found the source. We debated for hours what to do with the capsule. Destroy it, try to transport it. Vlad warned against both. Destruction might release it entirely. Transport would only spread its influence. He insisted it must remain sealed, buried deeper. Colonel Andrei proposed a collapse. Use the shaped charges from our last cache. Bring down the mountain pass above the gorge. Bury the bunker and the seed beneath a kilometre of rock. It wouldn't destroy it, but it would entomb it. The plan had merit, but there was one problem. We had no exfil route. Once the charges were set, the only exit would be the same tunnel Vlad had used to draw the infected away. We would have to make our way back through the Black Cross Gorge and hope the Strigoi hadn't regrouped. Mihai and Christie volunteered to stay behind, to wire the charges and detonate them remotely. They would wait for us to reach the ridge, then collapse the pass and seal the tunnel behind it. Neither of them hesitated. Mihai handed me his wedding ring before we left. "Give it to Adina," he said, "if she's still in Brasov." We left at nightfall. The cold was absolute. A stillness that made every breath feel like it might crack your lungs. Vlad led the way, silent and sharp-eyed. The infected had dispersed, but not far. We moved through the gorge like ghosts, skirting frozen streams and low boulders, ears tuned to every echo. Halfway to the ridge, the Strigoi returned. They came without sound, black shapes against the snow, their weapons ancient and crusted. Vlad drew his sword and advanced without waiting. We formed a crescent behind him, rifles braced. Emil reciting the Psalm of Michael under his breath. The fight was not a battle, but an exorcism. Where bullets failed, Vlad's blade cut true. When he struck the Strigoi, they screamed in voices that did not belong to men. We reached the ridge just before sunrise. The mountain loomed behind us, dark against the lavender sky. Then the world cracked open. A rolling thunder split the gorge as the charges detonated in sequence. First one, then 5, then dozens, each blast echoing up through the narrow cut in the earth. A column of dust and fire erupted from the bunker's location, followed by a low rumble as the rock face folded in on itself. The entire slope collapsed, burying the facility, the capsule, and Mihai and Christie with it. The infected howled once, long and mournful, and then fell still. The silence that followed was so deep it made my ears ring. We returned to Bran days later, tired beyond language. The castle had held. The survivors greeted us with cautious hope. Father Emil buried Mihai's ring beneath the western chapel, beside the graves of the others we'd lost. Colonel Andrei returned to his maps and radio logs, already planning a push toward the southern valleys. There were rumors of a Red Cross convoy in Timisoara. Maybe it was still operating. Vlad didn't rest. In the upper study of the western tower, once a museum exhibit filled with dusty dioramas and faded tourist placards, he laid out parchment maps and vellum scrolls like a general revisiting old battlefields. He worked without sleep, flanked by flickering candles and old symbols scrawled in chalk across the stone floor. I joined him one morning just before dawn, the heavy wooden floorboards creaking beneath my boots. He didn't look up, just gestured to the far wall where he'd pinned a reproduction of the Tabula Portingeriana, a Roman-era map of the empire's roads and strongholds. Over it, he had traced a pattern in red twine connecting 7 marked sites: Snagov, Padureia Hoya, Sarmizegatusa, Kronstadt, and then across the old empire into Central Europe, Regensburg, Vienna, and finally, Belgrade. "What are they?" I asked, my voice hoarse from sleep and smoke. "Vaults," he said. "Keys, witnesses. I don't know the right word anymore. When Constantine's empire collapsed and Rome burned, men like me were scattered. We were not legion, not united, just remnants. But even then, some of us remembered what had been buried beneath the old world. We built these places to contain the fragments. The seed we found beneath the Black Cross Gorge was one, but it was not the first, and it will not be the last to awaken." I studied the names on the map. Each location corresponded to a historical site that had seen blood, conflict, and sudden silence in the days leading up to the outbreak. The Hoya forest near Cluj-Napoca had become a no-go zone for weeks before communications went dark. The ruins of Sarmizegatusa, the ancient Dacian capital, had reportedly burned to the ground after a lightning storm that left no survivors among the archaeologists stationed there. Vienna's central catacombs, once a morbid tourist attraction, had sealed themselves after an explosion in early March. Belgrade had been broadcasting rescue signals one day, and the next, only static. Vlad didn't speak of it as prophecy. He didn't need to. The evidence was rational, mapped and disturbingly consistent. These seeds, as he called them, weren't viral or biological in the conventional sense. They were anchors, psychic faults buried beneath the skin of Europe, each one holding back something older than language. And now that the veil had thinned, they were awakening in sequence, like code being executed after centuries of dormancy. Colonel Andrei came up later that morning, still smelling of field grease and wet leather, a map tube slung under his arm. He unrolled a satellite photo set from a French military drone, taken weeks before the satellite grid fully collapsed. Most of Europe was already gone. Streets jammed with burned-out vehicles, cities swallowed by forest fire or flooding. But Vienna's old city showed something strange. Infrared highlighted an underground chamber beneath the Stephansplatz. Whatever was inside was cold, unnaturally cold, but shaped with disturbing symmetry. Not natural ice or rock, something constructed. We made our plan. The survivors in Bran would remain under Emil's care, holding the region as long as possible. Colonel Andrei, Vlad, myself, and a hand-picked escort of 5, including Sander, the communications officer from Targu Mures, and a Roma scout named Iosif, who had mapped every trail west of the Carpathians, would travel to Vienna via the Mures and Danube corridors. A Romanian armoured personnel carrier had been hidden in a cave north of Rasnov, with fuel siphoned from the Red Cross depot in Brasov and parts scavenged from the Sibiu train yard. We could make it run, barely. We'd travel at night, avoiding major cities. Our goal, the catacombs of Vienna. The day we left, the castle bell rang once, a funeral toll. Emil placed a medallion in Vlad's hand before we crossed the drawbridge. For the relic, he said, not for protection, for recognition. The medallion was bronze, stamped with the sigil of the Archangel Uriel, wings spread over a burning gate. I had seen it before, on a ruined monastery door in Moldova, centuries old, long since buried by war. The first leg of the journey was the worst. Roads hadn't been cleared in weeks. Abandoned vehicles blocked tunnels, and infected still wandered the forest margins, drawn to sound and scent. Our APC, a TBC 79, rattled like a dying horse with every kilometre, but it kept moving. We used encrypted field radios, transmitting in short pulses, triangulating any surviving repeaters. We passed through Alba Iulia in silence, the bastion walls blackened from fighting. The cathedral square half collapsed, no movement, no survivors. In Hungary, we crossed the M1 under cover of night. Budapest burned in the distance, silent, distant, like a memory of fire. We stopped only once, at a ruined roadside chapel outside Győr. The walls were covered in charcoal drawings, scenes of angels with broken wings, mouths stitched shut. Vlad stared at them for a long time. Not visions, he said finally, echoes. By the time we reached the Austrian border, the Danube had flooded twice. Roads were swampy or broken entirely. We detoured south through abandoned vineyards, keeping to the high ridges. We saw no aircraft, no active columns, just packs of stragglers, either feral or beyond help. Sander recorded frequencies as we passed. Occasionally we picked up bursts of old Morse code, one in Serbian, one in German, both repeating numbers, coordinates maybe, or burial codes. We didn't stop to decode them. Vienna was silent. We entered the outskirts through Meidling, bypassing the ring roads and rail lines. The APC's diesel finally died 10 kilometers from the city centre. We continued on foot, weapons drawn, moving through neighbourhoods where every window was broken and every shop door hung open like a mouth. In the Karlsplatz, a pile of corpses had been arranged into a spiral, head inward, bones bleached. No animal signs, no rot, just silence. The catacombs beneath St. Stephen's Cathedral were blocked, collapsed, booby-trapped and sealed with magnesium lines that Vlad said were wards of containment, not defence. We used rope to descend through a collapsed side chamber, squeezing through passages choked with dust and debris. The deeper we went, the colder it became. Our breath fogged. The walls began to glisten with frost, despite the heat above ground. Then we saw it. The chamber was spherical, carved, not dug. In the center, suspended in a lattice of silver and obsidian, floated a second capsule, smaller than the one in Romania, but identical in shape and construction. Beneath it, etched into the floor in concentric rings, were symbols not from any known alphabet. Vlad stepped forward, his hand outstretched. The air shimmered. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, like a memory trying to surface. Then the capsule pulsed. Not light, not heat, just awareness. It knew us. Iosif collapsed, blood pouring from his nose. Sandra vomited and clutched her stomach, eyes wide with terror. Colonel Andrei raised his rifle, but Vlad barked a single word, "No!" and the weapon jammed. He moved toward the capsule, slow and deliberate, and began to speak. Not in Romanian, not in Latin, but in something older, guttural, elemental. The capsule calmed. The pressure lifted. I helped Iosif to his feet. His pulse was weak but steady. Vlad turned to us, sweat beading on his forehead. "This one is tethered to the others. A central node. We can't destroy it, but we can break the sequence." We rigged the lattice with shape charges, not to detonate, but to sever the anchor points. When the cradle collapsed, the capsule fell inert, like a hibernating cell cut off from its signal. Vlad placed Emil's medallion inside the containment ring and reactivated the ward. The symbols burned into the stone like iron into flesh. As we ascended, the cathedral bell, untouched by human hands, began to ring. Outside, the infected had vanished. We returned to Romania weeks later. The survivors in Bran had held. Emil stood in the courtyard with a radio in one hand, tuning in to a new frequency. A convoy had made it through Serbia. Red Cross, UN, even remnants of NATO. Not to fight, to listen. The apocalypse hadn't ended, but something had changed. In the tower that night, Vlad sat across from me in silence, watching the mountains through the open window. The stars above were cold and bright. "This world was always theirs," he said quietly. "We were only visitors." I asked him what would happen if more seeds awakened. He looked at me, tired beyond death, and said, "Then we keep fighting." And I believed him. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.